In an age without fans, air conditioners, or even basic electricity, entire cities somehow survived the crushing heat of summer. While modern homes struggled to stay cool without a power grid, medieval households used methods so clever they seem advanced even by today's standards. But how did people, especially in sun-scorched regions, build homes that could beat the heat? And what forgotten architectural secrets did they rely on? The answer lies in a lost way of living, one shaped by survival, ingenuity, and the brutal rhythms of nature. In today's world, relief from heat is as easy as flipping a switch. Air conditioning, ceiling fans, and climate-controlled homes have reshaped our relationship with summer. But for the people of medieval Europe, there were no switches to flip, no cold air humming through vents, and no refrigerated escapes. Comfort was not engineered to be endured. Medieval summers could be brutally hot, especially in southern Europe. The Mediterranean sun was relentless, baking stone streets and adobe walls until they radiated heat well into the night. In cities like Cordoba, Palermo, or Constantinople, temperatures regularly pushed beyond 35 degrees Celsius. Further north, while the climate was milder, the occasional heat waves that swept through England or the Germanic states still brought discomfort and danger. Homes offered little refuge. In towns, houses were tightly packed, often 2 or 3 stories tall, trapping heat in narrow streets below. Windows were small and glazed only for the wealthy. Most were covered with cloth, wooden shutters, or oiled parchment that blocked air as much as it did sunlight. Fireplaces used in colder seasons only added to the trapped warmth when not in use, and insulation was virtually non-existent by today's standards in the countryside. Thatched roof cottages were marginally better at breathing, but they lacked any deliberate ventilation design. During hot months, interiors became stuffy by midday. The combination of tightly sealed construction and open hearth cooking made the heat inside many homes oppressive. Shade was a privilege of trees or stone walls. Cooling down meant retreating into the thickest structure nearby, often a church, cellar, or hillside cave. For most people, there was no concept of indoor comfort as it exists now. Children, elders, and laborers alike were exposed to the same heat from dawn to dusk. Work routines adjusted out of necessity. Field work began before sunrise and paused during the hottest part of the day, not because of luxury but because exhaustion or dehydration could be fatal. Water was drawn from wells and rivers, stored in clay jars kept in cool corners of homes. Baths, when they happened, were rare more for hygiene or religious customs than relief from heat. Still, people survived, not just through endurance, but through adaptation, through knowledge passed down generations. Building design, daily routines, and social customs all evolved in response to the elements, which raises the central question: in a world without electricity, how did entire societies learn to stay cool? The answer lies not just in materials or methods, but in a way of life shaped entirely by climate. In medieval Europe, architecture wasn't just about shelter, it was a response to the environment. Long before thermometers or scientific blueprints, builders understood that materials, layout, and structure could mean the difference between tolerable and unbearable heat. Every design feature in a medieval home, especially in warmer regions, served a practical purpose, keeping the searing summer air out and the cooler interior air in. The first line of defense was material. In the Mediterranean, where summer heat could be punishing, stone was the dominant choice. Thick limestone or sandstone walls, often more than half a meter thick, absorbed heat slowly throughout the day. By the time the heat finally penetrated the full depth of the stone, the sun was already setting. At night, those same walls would radiate warmth back out, stabilizing indoor temperatures and offering passive cooling well before the term ever existed. In southern Spain, for instance, Moorish builders used whitewashed stone and plaster surfaces, which reflected sunlight and delayed heat absorption in northern Europe. Timber-framed homes with wattle and daub walls were more common. Though less effective at regulating heat than stone, these materials were still chosen for their local availability and insulating properties. Builders packed straw, mud, and animal dung into wooden lattice, which created walls that could breathe. These homes were warmer in winter, but still offered some resistance to the summer sun, especially when combined with design techniques such as overhanging roofs or shaded eaves. Ceiling height was another intentional feature. In wealthier homes and public buildings, high-vaulted ceilings allowed hot air to rise above head level. In southern Italy and Sicily, palazzi were built with inner courtyards and double-height halls, not for show but because they helped draw hot air away from living spaces. Arched ceilings and domes were not just structural marvels, they were passive climate control. Windows, too, were shaped by necessity. In many medieval homes, windows were narrow slits or small square openings. This wasn't due to a lack of glass technology, it was a strategic choice. Large windows would have invited the sun in. Smaller ones reduced exposure while still allowing a minimal breeze. In wealthier urban households, glass panes were rare and expensive. Most relied on shutters, wooden lattice, or translucent materials like oiled parchment or animal horn to diffuse sunlight without sacrificing airflow. In Islamic Spain, where architectural innovation blended with centuries of desert wisdom, features like mashrabia screens and shaded arcades were common. These wooden lattice windows projected out from upper stories, allowing for ventilation while shielding from direct sun. Courtyards with water features and shaded walkways created microclimates within homes. These ideas, brought through Moorish influence, would eventually shape European design in subtle but lasting ways. Roofs were often steeply pitched in colder, wetter regions to shed rain and snow, but in southern towns, flatter roofs served a different purpose. Families sometimes slept on rooftops during summer nights, when indoor heat became stifling. These open platforms caught cooler evening breezes and were often surrounded by low walls or parapets for privacy. The layout of entire towns reflected this logic. Streets were narrow and winding, creating shade and minimizing sun exposure throughout the day. High walls, overhangs, and adjacent structures shaded each other. In densely packed cities like Fez or Cairo, though not part of medieval Europe, but relevant for comparison, this principle was so refined that parts of the Medina remained cool even at midday. What might seem quaint or primitive today was, in reality, the result of centuries of observation and adaptation. Builders didn't need thermodynamics to understand comfort. They built it into the walls, the windows, and the very shape of life. Beneath many medieval homes, often hidden from street view, were the spaces that offered the most reliable relief. From heat, cellars, basements, and semi-subterranean rooms. These underground areas weren't simply for storage. They were vital parts of how people managed temperature before thermometers or refrigeration on much of Europe. The upper layers of soil remained cool year-round, averaging around 10 to 13 degrees Celsius in temperate regions. Builders understood this long before modern science explained it. by digging below the surface. They accessed the Earth's stable core temperature, natural buffer against seasonal extremes. In England, for example, food cellars were a common feature even in modest rural homes. Dug into hillsides or beneath cottages, they stored perishables like root vegetables, cheese, and cured meats. But during summer months, these cellars served a second purpose. When upper floors became stuffy or unbearable, families sometimes retreated below. The air was heavier and damp, but noticeably cooler. In areas like Norfolk or Yorkshire, some medieval manors even featured vaulted stone undercrofts large enough to serve as secondary living quarters. In hotter climates, like southern Italy or the Iberian Peninsula, the use of subterranean spaces was even more advanced. In regions such as Apulia, inhabitants of towns like Matera carved entire homes into the limestone cliffs. These cave dwellings, known as sassi, maintained stable temperatures year-round, cool in summer, warm in winter. The porous stone acted as a giant thermal sponge, slowly absorbing and releasing heat in sync with the changing environment. Thermal mass. The ability of a material to absorb and store heat energy was at the core of this design logic. Stone, earth, and even packed clay had high thermal mass. When these materials lined walls or surrounded rooms, they absorbed daytime heat and delayed its release, smoothing out temperature spikes. Unlike wood or plaster, which respond quickly to external changes, these materials created a thermal lag, allowing indoor spaces to remain cooler even after sunset. In France, particularly in the wine-producing regions of Burgundy and Bordeaux, subterranean cellars weren't just used for storage. Builders intentionally designed them with temperature and humidity in mind. These underground rooms stayed between 11 and 14 degrees Celsius, ideal not just for preserving wine, but also for escaping the summer sun. Nobles and clergy often used such spaces as workrooms or retreats during peak heat. In the Middle East and North Africa, similar strategies emerged. In places like Iran and Syria, underground dwellings known as qanats or badges were used in combination with subterranean chambers to pull air through cool. Even monasteries employed these techniques. In Benedictine abbeys, storerooms and kitchens were often placed in the coolest, lowest levels of stone buildings. These areas remained functional regardless of season, allowing monks to preserve herbs, wine, and grain even through hot summers. What seems like primitive construction was, in truth, refined adaptation. Medieval builders used the physics of their environment without modern measurements or theories. By building downward, they created one of the few spaces where heat could be held at bay, not by resisting nature, but by working alongside it. In a time before mechanical fans or air conditioning, airflow wasn't a convenience, it was architecture. Across medieval Europe and the broader Mediterranean, passive cooling relied on air movement, shade, and structure. Builders learned to read the land, orient walls, and position openings in ways that turned even a light breeze into an advantage. Cross-ventilation was one of the most effective methods. In regions with relatively predictable wind patterns, such as southern France, parts of the Italian peninsula, or the Levant, homes were often aligned to face prevailing winds. Openings on opposite walls allowed air to pass through, flushing out hot, stagnant air. In cities like Avignon or Toledo, the placement of doors and windows was not random. In narrow streets, homes were angled just enough to catch moving air from shaded alleys, funneling it inside with surprising efficiency. Internal courtyards, common in Islamic Spain and southern Italy, acted as thermal regulators. The layout of a home would often wrap around an open-air space. Walls shaded the interior, and water features or vegetation in the courtyard added humidity to the dry summer air, creating microclimates that were cooler and more comfortable. These enclosed yards weren't ornamental, they were tools for survival. The Alhambra in Granada, built in the 13th and 14th centuries, integrated this idea at a monumental scale. Its layout guided air across reflecting pools and shaded colonnades, reducing heat through design rather than force. Openings in upper walls, such as clear-story windows or high vents, allowed hot air to rise and escape. In wealthier homes and monasteries, the concept of a thermal, chimney-warm air rising, cool air entering at lower levels was applied without formal terminology. High ceilings and open rafters allowed the air to circulate vertically, especially during the hottest parts of the day. Heavy curtains and fabric screens also played a role. In Mediterranean homes, thick drapes were soaked in water and hung in front of windows. As the breeze passed through, it evaporated moisture from the cloth and cooled the early form of evaporative cooling. In Islamic architecture, wooden lattice screens known as mashrabiyah filtered harsh sunlight while permitting air to flow, offering both ventilation and privacy. These elements eventually influenced window designs in regions of southern Europe exposed to Arab or Moorish rule. Even city planning contributed. In dense urban areas such as Cairo or Palermo, narrow streets and tall buildings created artificial canyons that remained shaded for most of the day. These shaded corridors cooled ambient temperatures and accelerated wind speed, a principle still applied in modern passive design. Orientation, height, and spacing weren't just matters of urban aesthetics, they were part of how cities kept themselves livable. Today, passive house standards emphasize similar principles, maximizing shade, using cross-ventilation and ceiling or insulating for thermal control. But centuries before these methods were codified, medieval builders had already put them into practice. Their techniques were not driven by theory, but by observation, trial, and necessity. When the summer heat bore down, it wasn't modern machines that kept people alive, it was the quiet intelligence of wind, shade, and flow. Across medieval societies, staying cool was as much about behavior as it was about buildings. People adapted their routines not by choice, but by necessity. When the heat grew intense, especially in southern climates, survival depended on knowing when to move, when to rest, and when to stay in the shade. In the Mediterranean world, stretching from Moorish Spain to the coasts of southern Italy and Greece, the heat of midday was simply avoided. Work began before sunrise. Farmers were often in the fields by dawn, tending to crops, irrigating, or harvesting. By late morning, when the sun became punishing, labor would stop. A pause in the day, commonly known as the siesta, wasn't a luxury. It was a widespread adaptation to environmental pressure. The word itself, derived from the Latin hora sexta, referred to the 6th hour of daylight, roughly noon, when the sun stood highest and heat peaked. During this time, entire towns would grow quiet. Markets closed, tools were set aside, streets emptied. The rhythm of life shifted accordingly. Meals were delayed. In places like 13th century Cordoba, dinner might not be served until well after sunset. Social gatherings, religious meetings, and trade often moved to the evening. In Muslim cities, especially in North Africa and Al-Andalus, night markets flourished in the warmer months. These SQs operated long after dusk, lit by oil, lamps and torches, offering a cooler atmosphere for business and social life. This nocturnal adaptation extended to public events, sermons, and even judicial proceedings in particularly hot seasons. Religious life, too, followed environmental rhythms. In monastic communities, the liturgy of the hours was already based on timekeeping that aligned with sunrise and sunset. Monks in Benedictine abbeys, for instance, began their prayers before dawn and often completed their day's labor by midday. This wasn't just spiritual discipline, it also made physical sense. In hot weather, manual work in fields or gardens was done early, leaving the hottest hours for reading, copying manuscripts, or indoor contemplation. In rural villages, peasants used the cool of early morning to prepare for the day. Water from distant wells, tending animals, baking bread in communal ovens. Women often performed household tasks in shaded courtyards or beneath overhanging roofs. Children were kept indoors or under supervision during peak heat. Clothing, usually linen or lightweight wool, was loose-fitting and layered to reflect sunlight and shield the skin. In larger cities like Damascus, Palermo, or Cairo, architecture and routine worked hand in hand. Narrow streets shaded by high walls made certain routes walkable only at specific hours. Vendors understood the daily shift in foot traffic and adjusted their schedules. Brickmakers, tanners, and blacksmiths saw occupations that generated additional. He'd started early and shut down before the afternoon intensified. This seasonal flexibility, though common, was not universal. In colder northern Europe, where extreme heat was less frequent, changes in routine were more modest. Still, even there, summer brought extended daylight, and work patterns shifted with the agricultural calendar. Adaptation wasn't formalized, but it was embedded in daily life. These practices didn't come from theory. They came from watching the sun, feeling the air, and listening to the body. In the medieval world, staying cool wasn't just a matter of architecture. It was a way of living in medieval life. Keeping cool wasn't limited to the design of buildings or the rhythm of daily routine. It extended to what people wore, how they handled water, and the small but consistent choices made throughout the day. Without refrigeration or synthetic fabrics, survival in hot climates required practical knowledge passed down through generations, simple methods that didn't rely on technology but on experience. Clothing, first and foremost, was adapted to climate long before textiles were industrialized. In the hotter regions of Europe's southern Spain, Sicily, and parts of the Balkans, people wore layers of breathable natural fibers like linen or finely woven wool. Contrary to modern intuition, layering wasn't just for warmth. A loose outer layer created shade against the body, allowing air to circulate between the fabric and the skin. Lighter colors were preferred in hotter regions, often undyed or bleached with ash and sunlight, reflecting heat rather than absorbing it. In Muslim-ruled areas such as Al-Andalus, long robes and head coverings became common, influenced by Arab traditions suited for desert climates. These garments reduced direct sun exposure while preserving moisture in the skin, an approach that proved functional across class and faith boundaries. Water, though not available on tap, played a quiet but constant role in thermal relief. In households with access to wells or public fountains, water was used not only for drinking or washing, but for cooling spaces. In many Mediterranean towns, linens or woven mats were soaked and hung over windows or doorways. As wind passed through the damp fabric, it cooled the air entering the room. This rudimentary evaporative technique, found in parts of southern Italy and Moorish Spain, was especially effective during hot, dry summers. Wealthier homes might use thin reeds or rushes, dipped in water, placed over openings to catch breezes. The effect was modest but noticeable. Public fountains and communal washing areas, often located in shaded parts of a village or monastery, became informal cooling stations. Children and workers might splash water on their faces and hands multiple times a day in cities such as Florence or Cordoba. Access to public cisterns and aqueduct-fed basins wasn't just for sanitation, it helped the community endure seasonal heat. Other habits reflected the same practical logic. Meals were adjusted to require less time over open flames. Cold dishes, bread, cheese, olives, dried meats, were staples in summer. Indoor fires, when used at all, were kept minimal. In peasant homes, cooking often shifted outdoors entirely, with temporary hearths or clay ovens set up in shaded courtyards or lean-tos. Sleep, too, was modified. In the hottest months, many slept with wet cloths on their foreheads or feet. In southern regions, it wasn't uncommon to bring sleeping mats outdoors to rooftops, courtyards, or even city walls, seeking any hint of breeze. None of these methods was revolutionary on its own, but together they formed a complete city in habit, observation, and necessity. Without electricity or artificial cooling, survival in summer relied on the body's own signals and the land's own patterns. And while the techniques varied between regions, the goal remained constant: to stay just cool enough to keep going. Centuries before mechanical air conditioning, engineers in the Islamic world had already developed complex, passive cooling systems suited for extreme climates. These systems weren't primitive stopgaps, they were engineered solutions rooted in mathematics, astronomy, and deep understanding of the environment. Their influence would stretch beyond deserts and oases, eventually shaping architecture across southern Europe. One of the most advanced and recognizable innovations was the bagia, or wind catcher. Common across Iran, Iraq, and parts of Egypt, these towers rose above homes and public buildings. Positioned to face prevailing winds, they captured moving air and funneled it downward into interior spaces. The design was simple but effective. In hot, arid cities like Yazd, where summer temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, the bagia directed fresh air inside, forcing warmer air upward and out through opposing vents. Some systems were paired with subterranean chambers or pools of water, cooling the air further before it entered living areas. The effect was enough to drop interior temperatures by several degrees without burning a single log or using a drop of oil. Below ground, another system played an equally important role. The qanat was an underground aqueduct that tapped into distant mountain springs or underground water tables. These sloped tunnels delivered water across vast distances without surface evaporation, feeding cities, agricultural zones, and cooling systems. By running channels through thick walls or beneath courtyards, the cold water helped maintain a lower ambient temperature. Cities like Damascus, Nishapur, and Fez relied on qanats for both irrigation and climate regulation. Their construction required precise surveying and years of labor. But once built, they could last centuries with minimal maintenance. Architecture as a whole reflected these principles. In Islamic homes, especially across North Africa and courtyards became central features, not ornamental but functional. Enclosed on all sides, shaded by walls or arcades, and often containing trees, fountains, or tiled floors. These courtyards created cool, humid microclimates within otherwise hot environments. Sunlight was controlled, airflow was guided, and temperature was regulated naturally. In cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada, this courtyard-centered design became the norm, blending aesthetics with environmental adaptation. By the 10th century, many of these techniques had already spread into southern Europe through contact with the Islamic world. Trade, conquest, and diplomacy accelerated this exchange. During the Crusades, European knights and clerics encountered cities in the Levant that used passive cooling on a large-scale mosques, baths, homes, and markets designed to stay cool in sweltering conditions. Returning to Europe, some brought these ideas with them, either directly or through the influence of captured cities. In Sicily, under Norman rule, Islamic architectural influence persisted even after conquest. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, built in the 12th century, displays elements of Arab-Norman fusion, not just in ornamentation, but in spatial layout and structural design suited for climate control. In southern Spain, the Mudayyar style emerged under Christian rule, but retained Islamic engineering elements, shaded arcades, geometric airflow systems, and inner courtyards remained standard. This cross-cultural exchange wasn't always acknowledged, but its impact was lasting. The solutions developed in desert cities, wind catchers, underground channels, shaded courtyards, were not only effective in their original context, but adaptable across borders. As Europe grew, it didn't just build higher. In many regions, it began to build smarter, guided in part by knowledge that came not from the north, but from the dry, sun-scorched lands of the Islamic world. Comfort in the medieval world was rarely distributed equally. The ability to stay cool during sweltering summers often depended more on social rank than regional climate. While architectural techniques existed to moderate heat, access to them varied sharply between peasants, nobility, and the clergy in noble estates and castles. Thick stone walls and high ceilings weren't just symbols of authority, they also functioned as passive cooling systems. These fortresses, especially those in southern France, Sicily, and parts of Iberia, were built with natural insulation in mind. Wealth allowed for multi-room layouts, shaded courtyards, and underground storage, chambers that doubled as cool retreats. The elite could afford labor to construct and maintain such features, and servants to draw water, hang soaked linens, or prepare shaded seating areas during midday heat. Tiled floors, sometimes imported from Islamic craftsmen, added to thermal comfort in warm regions. Monasteries, particularly Benedictine and Cistercian complexes, also enjoyed relatively advanced environmental design. Built with both spiritual discipline and physical function in mind, these religious centers featured cloisters that created enclosed, shaded courtyards, often surrounded by high walls and gardens. Cloisters allowed monks to move and work in relative cool. Stone refectories and scriptoria, where monks read or copied manuscripts, were built with minimal windows and thick masonry retaining cooler air and blocking heat. In wealthier abbeys, cellars were used not only for storing food and wine, but also as workspaces during hotter seasons. In contrast, most peasants had little more than mud brick or timber-framed homes. Thatch roofs offered basic shelter, but did little to regulate temperature. Small windows and low ceilings trapped heat, and ventilation was minimal. In some regions, entire families shared a single-room dwelling with livestock, further complicating airflow. Cooling methods were makeshift and community-based. People took refuge under trees, beside wells, or inside earthen cellars if such spaces existed. Clothing, timing of labor, and proximity to water were often the only tools available. Even within towns, there was a clear gradient. Wealthier urban residents lived in multi-story stone homes with internal courtyards or shaded galleries. Merchants and guild members could afford access to water, textiles, and tools that allowed for modest cooling methods. The poor, living in overcrowded alleys or wooden tenements, were left exposed to reflected heat from cobblestones and fire-prone rooftops. In London, for example, where homes clustered tightly around open markets, temperatures could rise sharply in summer, and outbreaks of illness often followed. Cooling was not only a matter of comfort, it became a reflection of hierarchy: who had space, who had shade, and who had the right to retreat from the sun mirrored the broader structures of power. In the medieval world, staying cool was a luxury, not a right, and like land, food, or protection, it was unevenly distributed. In the heart of older cities, Cordova, Fez, Matera, Damascus, cool air still lingers in shaded courtyards, narrow alleys, and thick-walled homes. The techniques that once allowed people to survive summer without electricity haven't disappeared. They've just been absorbed into the landscape, mistaken for tradition, or rebranded as modern design. But these weren't stylistic choices. They were engineering decisions born from necessity. In the Andalusian towns of southern Spain, houses still feature patios, internal courtyards designed not just for privacy, but to trap, shade, and draw cooler air into surrounding rooms. The layout, developed under Moorish rule between the 8th and 15th centuries, follows the same principles as contemporary passive cooling systems. Stone floors, central fountains, reflective white walls, and limited window exposure all work together to regulate temperature. These same ideas were imported into Spanish colonial architecture and spread across North Africa and Latin America, where they continue to shape building design in hot climates. In Iran, wind catchers, bargas, still crown rooftops in cities like Yazd. Though some have fallen into disrepair, others have been restored, not for tourism, but because they still work. Their form and function predate modern HVAC by centuries, yet they achieve similar results using no power. By channeling air down through internal shafts, and sometimes across underground water channels, they maintain surprisingly stable indoor conditions in an otherwise harsh desert environment. In southern Italy, particularly in the ancient cave dwellings of Matera, carved homes continue to regulate heat naturally through the same thermal mass principles that once kept entire families and food stores cool in the scorching summer months. The rock absorbs heat slowly and releases it gradually, preventing the wild temperature swings common in surface structures. Even the city layouts, winding streets, overhanging upper floors, communal water basins, had a cooling logic. In Fez, Morocco, parts of the old Medina remained cooler than the newer, more spacious neighborhoods. In the medieval districts of Cairo, where buildings shade each other and the alleys are narrow by design, daily temperatures feel less extreme compared to adjacent open areas. These weren't accidents. They were urban planning shaped by climate and resource constraints. Today, some architects are revisiting these old methods, branding them as sustainable or eco-friendly design. But they're not inventions, they're rediscoveries. What's sold as innovation often has roots in medieval adaptation: cross-ventilation, thermal insulation, evaporative cooling, shaded courtyards. None of these ideas are new. What changed wasn't the environment. It was the assumption that comfort had to come from machines. Yet the people who lived through Europe's long pre-industrial centuries, without refrigeration, without fans, without electricity, left behind evidence that another approach is not only possible, but still standing. Hidden in plain sight, their genius is not forgotten. It's just been overlooked. For centuries, people endured heat waves without electricity, air conditioning, or refrigeration. They relied on observation, adaptation, and building techniques shaped by environment, not excess. Today, many of those solutions still exist embedded in ancient towns, preserved in forgotten blueprints, or hidden behind layers of modern renovation. What changed was not the climate, but the tools we chose to trust. In recent decades, architecture turned toward consumption. Power grids replaced orientation. Insulation gave way to artificial airflow. But as energy demand climbs and heat waves become more frequent, the systems that once replaced ancient knowledge are now showing limits. Air conditioners contribute to urban heat islands. Constant cooling drains resources. The gap between technological capacity and environmental resilience grows wider each year. Yet the solutions aren't theoretical. They already exist. Shaded courtyards, cross-ventilation, thermal mass, water-cooled air, orientation based on solar patterns. These weren't fringe experiments. They were tested at scale over centuries. In places as diverse as Moorish Spain, Persian cities, and medieval Italian towns. These methods sustained entire populations without fossil fuel, without carbon emissions, and without collapse. What was once standard practice has become rare expertise. But it's not beyond recovery. Sustainable design today doesn't need to reinvent the concept of livable architecture. It needs to remember it. This isn't just a story of how people survived the heat. It's a record of what we abandoned in the name of progress and what we may need to reclaim to face the century ahead.